When Final Fantasy Tactics launched in June of 1997, it received numerous plaudits from critics and fans alike. Everyone, including Hironobu Sakaguchi, had been impressed at how Yasumi Matsuno and his team had taken an established brand such as Final Fantasy and melded it to create something that still had many familiar traits but was also wholly original. As a result, Final Fantasy Tactics, even to this day, is still a very influential game, and even though it did not have the same impact as, say, Final Fantasy VI, VII or VIII, there are those within the fanbase who still look back with fond memories of what turned out to be a punishing but brilliant game. Today, we are going to be running through some lesser known details about Final Fantasy Tactics. The hope is that we will provide additional insight into the process behind its creation, reveal reasons as to why certain decisions were made, and why we ultimately ended up receiving the final version of the product that we did. So, be sure to subscribe if you have not done so already for more high quality Final Fantasy content, and from the reason why super characters were allowed to exist through to an entire segment of lore that was flat out cut from the Western version, let's run through some very obscure facts about Final Fantasy Tactics in our typical granular style. Oh, and don't forget to keep your eyes peeled for lots of little bonus facts along the way. Acting as the director, when Final Fantasy Tactics launched to significant praise, a lot of that praise was rightly directed towards Yasumi Matsuno. But what's interesting is that the idea for creating Final Fantasy Tactics did not come from Matsuno. It instead came from the father of Final Fantasy himself, Hironobu Sakaguchi. After moving into the role of Executive Vice President at Square in 1991, following the continued success and evolution of the Final Fantasy franchise, even though Sakaguchi was still responsible for working on and helping to guide individual titles, he also needed to look at the bigger picture, and this related to how Square could continue to stay relevant in an ever-changing competitive industry while also increasing the sales of their games. Outside of overseeing the production of new numbered iterations of the Final Fantasy franchise, this saw Sakaguchi explore alternative areas for expansion. Chrono Trigger was the result of one such piece of exploration, and another would see the standard notion of Final Fantasy fused with a complementary genre, the tactical RPG. Sakaguchi came up with the idea of creating a tactical version of Final Fantasy when working on Final Fantasy VI, but even though Final Fantasy Tactics ended up being the final realization of that idea, it's rumoured that it was not the first attempt. Just over a year before Tactics was released, Square put out another game called Bahamut Lagoon. This was created under the supervision of Sakaguchi, with Kazushige Nojima installed as director. It too saw traditional turn-based combat blended with a more tactical gameplay style, but it was not derivative of the likes of Tactics Ogre or Fire Emblem, trailblazers in that particular subgenre. According to the rumour, at one point, Bahamut Lagoon was planned to be released as a tactical Final Fantasy game, but for unknown reasons it ended up being renamed, and when Yasumi Matsuno was hired from Quest, he was assigned the task by Sakaguchi of iterating on what he'd created with Tactics Ogre to bring to market what will creatively be called Final Fantasy Tactics. Throughout development, Matsuno worked with Hiroyuki Itou and other senior creators such as Hiroshi Menagawa and Akihiko Yoshida to create an experience that was packed with quality, and this related to every aspect of the game, from the narrative through to the music, the characters and the gameplay mechanics. It also related to the visuals, and the decision was taken to adopt a similar style to what had been seen with Tactics Ogre, but Matsuno believed it could be suitably enhanced by making some small tweaks, although those tweaks did not necessarily relate to graphics, and this ambition was not without consequence. Matsuno had been fascinated by dioramas from a young age, and had often created physical ones to retell stories. He believed that dioramas could be used to heighten the immersion of the classic tactical combat aesthetic by allowing players to pan around the isometric action as opposed to seeing it from just one perspective. Matsuno was adamant that if they were to do this with Final Fantasy Tactics, players would not accept anything less than 60 frames per second, but realizing the stream would turn out to be quite complicated. Unlike Tactics Ogre, which was developed for the SNES, Final Fantasy Tactics was being developed for the PlayStation, and although this meant the hardware specifications were increased and they had much more raw horsepower to play with, The one restriction was that due to the change in medium from cartridge to CD-ROM, it was much harder for them to maintain 60 frames per second. It meant there had to be some compromises to realise Matsuno's vision, and it led to the developers needing to be quite creative. Instead of featuring huge maps filled with lots of units from both sides, it saw Tactics utilise much smaller 16 by 16 grids, and strict limits were placed on the number of units players could select. But even though everything was much smaller in literal scale, the developers still wanted the maps to feel grand and epic, and they attempted to achieve this by including ambitious set pieces and by focusing more on the vertical element. By doing this, and by making other changes under the hood, the developers were able to achieve that seamless 60 frames per second goal, and Matsuno's dream of having combat feel like the player was watching a diorama was able to be realised. As other concepts were explored, the developers mulled over which elements could be included to make the game feel like a Final Fantasy experience despite the change in genre. It saw numerous elements put forth, and one of them was the classic job system. Jobs had featured since the original Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy 3 and 5 had featured increasingly complex iterations that revolved around ability learning and allowing players to change jobs so that they could adapt to the various challenges laid out before them. For Tactics, Hiroyuki Itou, who had been responsible for refining the job system when working on Final Fantasy V, sought to enhance the system and make it feel much more dynamic. In the most basic sense, it was important to make sure that many of the classic jobs that had already been introduced within the mainline games were amongst the roster available, but plenty of original jobs such as the Astrologian, Arithmetician, and Archer were also created to make the system feel fresh for veterans. In total, when including the numerous special jobs, this meant Final Fantasy Tactics featured 34 individual job classes, a significant increase compared to both Final Fantasy 3 and 5. Due to each job having specific strengths and weaknesses, this increase in scope afforded players with a lot of room to experiment. But the system was also made a lot more dynamic than previous iterations thanks to a new implementation of job points. Job points have been used in Final Fantasy 3 and 5 as a way of leveling up a job in isolation to the character who was using it. This system was retained for Tactics, but it saw a significant evolution by having an array of abilities connected to each job and having the way they were learnt not mandated to the player. Instead, it would be up to the player to decide which abilities they wanted to learn and in what order, something that would be facilitated by spending accrued job points. Due to the breadth of jobs and the scale of their utility, there were over 400 individual abilities that could be learnt, and as there was no limit to the amount of abilities a single character could learn, it was possible to create what the developers dubbed super characters. It might seem like an oversight, as creating these super characters would make the game unbalanced, but Itou planned the job system to work this way, and the reason for doing so was so that the job system would dovetail with the game's narrative theme that people should be useful no matter their class or social standing.
I would save Tetra with these hands, if aught were in my power to do.
To help convey this narrative point in a more literal sense, Matsuno introduced an extensive array of NPCs into the world of Final Fantasy Tactics, each with their own motivations and ties back to either Ramza or Delita. And perhaps one of the more interesting branches was the Church of Glabados. Marcel Funebris served as the High Confessor of the Church, but it was the Church's militaristic arm, known as the Knights Templar, who often stole the spotlight owing to their close connection with the Lucavi. The Knights Templar served Folmarv, and he was supported in this endeavour by his son Isolde, his daughter Meliadul, and Lofri, Cletien, and Barich. There were also many unnamed members of the church who would appear in support throughout various combat situations, and Wygraf joined as the story progressed to help bolster their numbers and their narrative strength. But in original drafts of the script, it has been revealed that the presence of the Knights Templar could have been even more significant. The original vision, as revealed by Matsuno in a tweet back in 2013, was for there to be 12 members of the Knights Templar, and this would have no doubt been planned as an ode to the famed 12 knights who appeared as part of the legends of King Arthur. The 6 just mentioned were part of this original unit of 12, although many of them ended up having different ages. Gustav and Gragoroth were also planned to be members before they were repurposed as leaders of the Corpse Brigade. The other 4 members did not end up featuring in the final product in any shape or form, and as a result did not even have their names localized. But as Matsuno posted their genders, we do know that one of them, who had the name Alfredo in Romanji, was planned to be female. The locking of equipment to certain jobs has been with the franchise since the original Final Fantasy, but it wasn't until Final Fantasy IV that female exclusive equipment was introduced. In that particular game, the gold hairpin and the Minerva bustier could only be worn by Rydia, Rosa and Porom, and although Final Fantasy V did not feature the same restriction, female exclusive armor featured again in Final Fantasy VI and VII, with VI also featuring a female exclusive relic called the Princess Ring. Final Fantasy Tactics expanded the scope of this gameplay mechanic significantly by having two classes of accessory created specifically for female warriors, Perfume and Lip Rouge. The Minerva bustier also appeared in Final Fantasy Tactics as a female-only piece of armor, and the hair adornments were created as a specific grouping of armor that was exclusive to female warriors. But there was an exception, as outside of Onion Knights, who were a super job that had access to anything and everything, Cloud Strife, an optional character who was appearing as a cameo, could also wear hair adornments. It has never been revealed as to why Cloud could wear hair adornments, but the popular theory is that the developers allowed Cloud to wear them as a nod to the famous sequence from Wall Market, where he needed to dress up as a woman to gain entry to Don Corneo's mansion. As an interesting aside, Final Fantasy Tactics also took the notion of female exclusive equipment further by introducing female exclusive weaponry. This related to bags, which could be used by any female character regardless of class, and cloths, which could only be used by dancers, a job class that was also exclusive to female characters. When Final Fantasy Tactics was released, Square was still attempting to figure out how to create a more streamlined and comprehensive localization process. Final Fantasy IV and VI had made their way to North American shores, but localization was an afterthought, and Final Fantasy V was lost along the way due to a lack of time and resources. Final Fantasy VII served as the first step in the right direction, but the same level of care and attention was not afforded to their less popular games, and many games during that time period weren't even released in Europe, despite being released in North America. Square released around 20 games between the releases of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, including the likes of Saga Frontier, Parasite Eve, Einhander, Front Mission 2, Xenogears, and Brave Fencer Musashi. But out of that selection, only Bushido Blade and Ehrgeiz ever made it to European shores. The quality of the localization for games that were released in North America was also poor, and Final Fantasy Tactics did not escape that fate. Legends of Localization even noted that they often got asked to cover Tactics because its translation was supposedly so poor that it was unintentionally funny. As a side note here, it's why there's so much love for Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions, as Alexander O. Smith and Joseph Reeder spent a considerable amount of time to make sure the localization was as good as it could be in relation to the original Japanese script. Outside of the original game suffering in this manner, the decision was also made to cut content due to time constraints and financial pressures relating to localization, and one of the prominent cuts was the sound novels. These were minigames found within the Japanese version that could be unlocked when a specific artifact was earned. They had no specific relation to the main plot, but did help to provide players with more context around the wider lore of Ivalice. Nanae's Book of Lives, for example, was written by the psychologist Nanae, and it featured an extensive look at the life of a gambler called Tango who frequently bet on chocobo racing. It's fascinating stuff, and if you have the time and are curious about Ivalician lore, then I'd recommend having a read yourself. You can find a link in the description below to translations of most of the sound novels, and these translations were done by Mark Rosa, aka Tully the Bubba. And that brings us on to an interesting final point relating to the story. Right at the beginning of the video, we highlighted that the original concept for a tactical Final Fantasy game came from Sakaguchi as opposed to Matsuno. When Matsuno joined Square, he was assigned to work on the project as the senior management team felt he would be best placed to make a strong game given the nature of what they proposed and his past experience. But one of the challenges was that because Final Fantasy Tactics was not his idea, Matsuno did not start out with some grand vision for how the story of the game would play out. And in the earlier days of the project, he was actually hoping he would be able to assign someone else to come up with the scenario concept and then write it. This was revealed via interviews that were published within the Vagrant Story Ultimania guidebook, where Matsuno gave a rather frank account of what it was like to work on some of his earlier titles like Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy Tactics. Within, he revealed that he prefers to be the unifier of talent as opposed to being the day-to-day person working on granular aspects of the game, but owing to staff shortages, he would often find himself mucking in alongside the rest of the team. For example, on Ogre Battle, this saw Matsuno manning phone lines for user support, answering calls from fans when they were stuck or just wanted to vent their frustration. He said, people would call in and say stuff like, "This game doesn't make any sense. Who's responsible for this mess? Put him on the line." And I'd respond, I'm sorry, that would be me. Matsuno revealed that he fulfilled this role for 4 months, and given that he was the director of the game and was receiving direct feedback from fans about how they felt about it, it was a fantastic learning experience, but also a psychologically exhausting one. When Matsuno was assigned to Tactics, he had expressed an interest in being the person who would create the battle system, but Square then chose to assign Itou to the project. Given his past experience, Matsuno did not feel as though it would make much sense to have Itou write the story. He should instead work on the battle system and gameplay mechanics. But as Square did not assign anybody to the project with the same level of experience as Itou to help with the scenario, Matsuno felt it was again something that he needed to do, owing to necessity. It turned out to be a great decision on his part, as Final Fantasy Tactics had a very strong story that has become revered owing to its compelling characters, political intrigue, and its significant dose of betrayal. And with that interesting nugget, I think we're done. They were 7 facts about Final Fantasy Tactics that we feel you probably didn't know, and as always we threw in a load of little bonus facts for good measure. Nonetheless, I'm pretty sure there are still some amongst you who knew them all. Let us know in the comments below which one you found to be the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please do be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It's at this point that I'd also like to make you aware that we've relaunched our sister channel, Kingdom Hearts Union. We will be creating very similar content over there around Kingdom Hearts, and we have just published a facts video about Sora, so if that's something of interest, please feel free to check it out. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Logan Nije and Benjamin Snow, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.